And then you've been through testimony, which we will not repeat, about all of this scrambling to find a way within the law to do the transaction without notifying Congress, correct?
That is correct.
And all of these different strategies and versions of the transaction that Mr. Niels took you through represented an effort to find a way within the various statutes as interpreted by the Attorney General to sell the arms without the notification to Congress. That's correct.
That is correct.
And on that subject, you had the Attorney General giving advice, correct? Attorney General blessed the form of the transaction.
It was my recollection, as I think I testified yesterday, that I actually carried the draft finding over to the Attorney General. I may be incorrect on that, but my recollection is that I met with the Attorney General and one of his deputies, I believe it was Mr. Jensen, got his approval on the finding, the procedures we were using, and the finding was subsequently signed by the President.
And were you also party to any discussions in which the Secretary of Defense said that he had cleared this with his legal counsel?
I don't recall talking to Secretary Weinberger directly about it. I may have.
Were you present at any meetings where the Secretary of Defense expressed his objection to the whole transaction?
No.
Were you present at any meetings at which the Secretary of State expressed his objections to the whole transaction?
Not that I recall.
Were you told of that they were still opposed in January? That can be answered yes, no, I think.
Well, yes, I suppose I had heard that they were opposed, but I did not hear then the stringent objections that have since been indicated.
Now, you did draft the cover memo, which is Exhibit 60 for the January 17 finding, did you not?
Which exhibit is that?
Prepared by Oliver North. It's Exhibit 60. Exhibit 60, and it's a memo from Admiral Poindexter to the President. It has the famous President was briefed verbally from this paper. Vice President Don Regan.
Where are we reading from here?
I'm reading from the third page, etc. That's the cover memo for the finding. You drafted that.
Oh,
Page 3, Counsel. What page, Mr. Liman?
Well, page 3 has it, what I just was reading in handwriting. And it says prepared by Oliver L. North.
Yes, I see it.
And were you present when the briefing occurred, if you recall?
I do not recall.
If you look at the first page, it says in the last lines on the first page, because the last 4 or 5 lines up, because of the requirements in U.S. law for recipients of U.S. arms to notify the U.S. government of transfers to third countries, I do not recommend that you agree with the specific details of the Israeli plan. However, there's another possibility. Some time ago, Attorney General William French Smith determined that under an appropriate finding, you could authorize the CIA to sell arms to countries outside of the provisions of the law and reporting requirements for foreign military sales. The objectives of the Israeli plan could be met if the CIA, using an authorized agent as necessary, purchased arms from the Department of Defense under the Economy Act and then transferred them to Iran directly after receiving appropriate payment from Iran. You recall that?
I do.
And do you also recall in this memorandum to the President that you indicated that if all of the hostages were not released after the first 1,000 tows were shipped, that further transfers would cease? That's the next to last paragraph on the page.
Yes, it does.
And do you remember that it was, in fact, the stated policy of the president that he would try to get the hostages back by a initial shipment of tows, but if they didn't deliver them all, it would stop?
Well, that was clearly the intent when this was prepared in January. That's correct.
And did you, in fact, receive in the month or so preceding the Tehran trip instructions from Admiral Poindexter that there were to be no there was to be no delivery of arms unless those hostages were released first?
I'm sorry, would you say that part again?
Did you receive instructions from Admiral Poindexter before the Tehran trip that there would be no delivery of arms unless all the hostages were released?
I recall that being the specific objective, and I think that was our specific objective in each of these transactions, that we would seek to limit any further transfers unless we got them all home immediately. But I think it is important to recognize that those of us who were engaged in the endeavor, particularly myself, General Secord, Mr. Cave, recognized that there was probably going to have to be some give and take. And I think that we made every effort to achieve the primary objective, all the hostages home, and then proceed with the initiative in its broader sense as we had originally defined it. But that the Iranians were unwilling throughout, not necessarily just because of Mr. Ghorbanifar, but to proceed apace so that they did not lose all of what they considered to be their leverage. I do not believe at any point that we had solid evidence, nor do we today, or did we at the point in time when I left anyway, that the Iranians exercised the kind of total control over the Hezbollah in the Lebanon that many people imagined. In other words, the Iranians, were unable, not just unwilling, but unable to snap their fingers and cause all of the hostages to be released at any given moment.
Well, Colonel, who is calling the shots on these negotiations for the United States?
Well, in the trip that I went with Mr. McFarland, clearly he was the chief negotiator.
And on the instructions that preceded the trip, the authorization as to how far you could go, who called the shots on that?
Well, certainly Admiral Poindexter gave the guidance.
And do you recall, and this is Exhibit 276, that Admiral Poindexter sent you a prop note saying, you may go ahead and go, but I want several points made clear to them, meaning the Iranians. There are not to be any parts delivered until all the hostages are free in accordance with the plan that you laid out for me before. None of this half shipment before any are released crap. It is either all or nothing. Also, you may tell them that the president is getting very annoyed at their continual stalling. And there were other prof messages to that effect, such as prof message 277, which is to Mr. McFarland, which is April 21. Here is the update on what we discussed Saturday. Blank is the Iranian...
I'm missing you on 277, Counsel.
I'm sorry, 279. It says, here is the update we discussed on Saturday referring to Mr. McFarlane and Admiral Poindexter. It says, and a name is deleted for the Iranian official, wants all of the Hawk parts delivered before the hostages are released. I have told Ali that we cannot do that. The sequence has to be 1, meeting, 2, release of hostages, 3, delivery of Hawk parts. The president is getting quite discouraged by this effort. This will be our last effort to make a deal with the Iranians. And then it says the next step is a Frankfurt meeting with Ghorbanifar, North, Cave, and the Iranian whose name is blanked out. You remember that those were your instructions?
That's correct.
And is it also a fact that when you were in Tehran, the Iranians suggested that they might be able to get 2 hostages released if you were prepared to proceed on that basis?
I recall that, but I also recall testifying to this committee that when we arrived in Tehran, it was evident that Ghorbanifar had lied to both sides. And there were expectations on the part of the Iranians that we were unwilling to meet. And my sense is that they made an effort to compromise based on what they had told Ghorbanifar before we arrived. And Ghorbanifar had not relayed to us. And the fact is, the Iranians took several steps, as best we were able to determine, to make those compromises, given their rather difficult political situation.
Those are telegrams that Oliver North has received in support from people around the country. Apparently there's been an enormous outpouring of support for his appearances here.
Well, the parts were parts for missiles, right?
Yes. Technical parts, they weren't warheads or anything like that.
Well, but they were parts that were necessary for those missiles and warheads to go and hit their targets, right?
Absolutely. But what the point I'm trying to make, counsel, is that we were misled by Ghorbanifar, and so were the Iranians. And the fact is, we had consistently tried to get beyond Ghorbanifar and the Israelis to establish our own direct contact. And when we got there was a willingness. The Iranians expected us, by what we were able to determine from them, to have arrived with everything. And when we didn't have everything, in fact, they kept looking up in the skies for another airplane. And when we didn't have everything, they asked where were the other parts. Furthermore, I don't believe that the Iranians were ever told by Ghorbanifar that we were expecting all of the hostages to be released that day. They very clearly indicated to Mr. Cave and myself on numerous occasions, both in the first and the second channel, that that was something that was probably beyond their capabilities, and that if all of the hostages were released simultaneously, it would be very clear to the whole wide world, which they did not want, that the Iranians were indeed the principal holders of the hostages. One of our proposals was to take a European who had been engaged in this effort, a humanitarian effort, and have him go to Tehran and have all the hostages received there. And the Iranians said, for heaven's sakes, the last thing in the world we want is all the hostages here. This is not our doing. These are people who have a philosophical loyalty but not necessarily control in Tehran.
Now, Colonel, given the fact that Ghorbanifar couldn't pass a lie detector test on his own name, it didn't surprise you that Ghorbanifar was acting like a broker, telling each side what it wanted to hear. That wasn't a shock to you.
Not at all. But the level of deception in this particular case was immense.
Now, you also said that that it was clear that the Iranians might not have control over all of the hostages. Is that so?
That is correct.
Now, when the president was giving all of these instructions that we're not going to ship arms to Iran, in breach of our own policy policy staunch unless we get the hostages back. Did anyone say to the President of the United States that they don't control the hostages?
I believe that there are memoranda from me. There are certainly clear indications from Director of Central Intelligence that we viewed this to be, first of all, a very, very difficult undertaking. It is, after all, the only one that ever brought any Americans home. And we recognized that. And if the inference is that I exceeded my mandate, I'll dispute that with you. We very clearly tried to present to the President, certainly I tried to present to my superiors, what the facts were as we knew them. And we modified the plan sometimes on scene and sometimes en route and sometimes in the intervening days between meetings.
General Secord, who was over in Israel, indicated that he thought we should have grabbed the deal for the 2 hostages. Did you advocate that when you were in Tehran?
I don't know what that has to do with this.
Did you?
I did.
And you were overruled?
I was.
And you were overruled by higher authority?
Mr. McFarlane was in charge of the trip.
And Mr. McFarlane was in communication with Washington?
And so was I.
And were you told by Admiral Poindexter that the deal is clear, all the hostages have to be released, but no more arms?
I don't believe I communicated that directly to Admiral Poindexter. I certainly articulated my opinion to Mr. McFarlane. Mr. McFarlane made a decision, and I saluted smartly and carried it out.
Well, didn't Mr. McFarlane have instructions from the President of the United States on what he could give and what he couldn't?
Apparently so.
Well, you knew that, didn't you?
I was not present when Mr. McFarlane was briefed by the President.
But you received these instructions yourself from Admiral Poindexter.
That's correct.
And you understood that the decisions here were being made in the Oval Office.
That's correct.
And is this testimony that you're giving now criticism of the fact that the decision was made to stand firm with the Iranians?
I am not criticizing the President's decisions, Admiral Poindexter's decision, or Mr. McFarlane. My role as a subordinate on the NSC staff was to provide advice and input. My advice at the time was to take the 2 hostages and go home.
Was the American foreign policy being driven to a great extent by concern about the welfare for these hostages?
Undoubtedly it was, but I viewed, and I think certainly Admiral Poindexter viewed, and in all of my discussions with the Iranians and the Israelis and others, I viewed the hostages as an obstacle. The obstacle had to be overcome like a hurdle before you could proceed on down the track, to use a little allegory. And what I'm saying to you is that if we could have gotten beyond the hostage issue, it would have been palatable publicly, internationally, and every other way to have meetings with high-level Iranian officials, first privately and ultimately publicly. And I viewed it all as a step-by-step process.
Did there ever come a moment when you asked yourself, why doesn't the Secretary of State agree with me? Why doesn't the Secretary of Defense agree with me?
They don't have to agree with me. I was simply providing advice and input and recommendations and options to my superiors. When they gave me direction, I carried them out.
Now,
I wasn't asking for the Secretary of State to agree with me.
Now, Colonel, Mr. McFarlane testified that there was a sense of dejection after this trip, and that you told him at the tarmac in Israel, you know, not everything worked out so bad, don't feel so poorly about it. We got some money for the Contras out of the proceeds. You remember that?
I don't recall doing it specifically on the tarmac at Ben Gurion Airport, but I'm sure I said it to him at some point in that process.
Now, you testified that the concept of using the proceeds from the Iranian sale to support the Contras was first suggested, as you recall it, by Gabanafar in that either January or February meeting?
I believe it was a January meeting.
January meeting. And at the time that he made the suggestion, there was a profit built into the transaction. Well, let's do it this way. There were the plan that the president had approved involved 4,000 tows. Do you recall that?
I'm trying to think if that preceded or succeeded the January meeting.
January, I will represent to you that the proposals that are described in the various memoranda, including those that went up the line, were for 4,000 tows.
Okay.
And you knew, and the documents show this, that the Iranians were prepared to pay to the Secord organization $10,000. Whatever Gabanafar was going to get, $10,000 per tow was going to flow to the Secord organization, right?
That's correct.
And you understood at some point that the Department of Defense was going to charge something like $3,500 a tow, right?
Something like that, because the price seemed to change every time he asked for the price.
There was at one point it was $6,000 a tow, and if it was $6,000 a tow, then the gross profit on 4,000 tows before expenses of transportation and so forth would be $16 million. 4,000 times 4,000. If the price was, as it turned out to be, about $3,500 a tow, then the gross profit was over $25 million. Right?
Okay, yeah.
And so there was, if this transaction went through, going to be a considerable surplus. You understood that?
Yes.
And is it fair to say, without getting into any of the details, that the surplus was going to be used for the Contras, and I'm not necessarily giving the order, for the Contras, it was going to be used to pay the cost of replenishing the 500-odd Israeli tows, and for some other covert operations of the United States and Israel.
That is correct.
And did you ever urge the Department of Defense to keep the price down so that the profits would be greater?
I don't recall doing that. I recall trying to get the price accurate. We went through a dickens of a time trying to...
But you don't recall saying, keep it down so that we'll have even more of a slush fund?
I do not recall that whatsoever.
Now, do you recall whether the idea of using profit for the Contras actually first came up in a meeting that you had with Israeli supply officials in the United States in or about December of 1985?
I don't recall that. My recollection was that the first time it was specifically addressed was during a meeting with Ghorbanifar. It may well have come up before, but I don't recall it.
Do you understood from information you had that the Israeli group, the private group that they were using as their cutout, were making profit, right?
Well, again, I don't want to be too specific. We knew that somebody was making profit.
And did you not have...
In fact, the first transaction may have been all profit.
And did you not, in fact, have some suspicion that that profit was being used for some covert purposes?
Yes.
And when, in December, you were giving consideration to having the United States replicate the Israeli system, did you not at that point give consideration to the fact that you could use these funds for a covert purpose?
In December?
Yes, sir.
I don't believe I did. I mean, I have no recollection of that. My clearest recollection, counsel, is that the first time the issue of using residuals came up was during Mr. Neer's visit at the end of December, early January. And I recall that we met New Year's Day or the day after, whatever, in that time period, maybe New Year's Eve. And it was his proposal at that point to use the profits by the arrangement that they envisioned, selling Israeli tows at a profit, replenishing them with part of that money, using part of that money for other operations.
Not the Contras.
I do not believe that he mentioned Contras at that meeting.
Now,
my recollection is we began to talk in early January about other joint U.S., Israeli, and in some cases unilateral Israeli operations of a certain kind that we discussed last night.
Colonel, was it you who raised in December of 1985 with the Israelis the idea of using residuals for the Contras?
You know, I have answered the question several times now. My recollection is that the first time I addressed the issue, or the issue was addressed to me, was in January, I think somewhere around the 20th, it may have been before that, at a meeting in Europe. I have absolutely no recollection. If you've got something up there that's in my notebooks that I've given you, please refresh me.
If it were in the notebooks, I would bring it to your attention, Colonel, because I'm not trying, and I want to make this very, very clear. I am not trying to trap you or to do anything like that. I just want the facts and your recollection, and you've just given it, as I understand it.
That's correct, counsel.
Now, which isn't to say that we don't have other information, but I want your recollection, and that's all you can give.
I'm giving it to you.
Now, when the decision...
If you have other information, such as a testimony or a statement, perhaps that would refresh the Colonel's recollection as well.
I've asked him the question, and I gather that the statement that I've just made as to whether or not you were the one who suggested it, which I can represent to you, is not something that I've pulled out of thin air, whether that refreshes your recollection. And your answer, I gather, is it just doesn't refresh your recollection.
It does not. I had, as you know, a number of discussions with Israeli officials starting in November that carried all the way on through January, when Mr. Neer was introduced to me as the principal point of contact for continuing the operation.
Colonel,
I'd kind of like to take credit for it instead of giving it to Mr. Ghorbanifar, but my recollection is it was his idea.
okay, now, Colonel North, when the decision was made to use the Secord organization as the vehicle in the transaction, I won't use the word agent because I know that you don't like the word, has legal significance, and but as the vehicle in this organization, was there any discussion about the fact that the residual would then be in the treasury of the very organization that was taking care of the Contra resupply.
No, you're talking about back in February when I engaged him? Certainly.
And when you talk to Director Casey about the fact of using the residuals, was there a discussion that the Seacourt organization would be in control of this money, and that it was the Seacourt organization that had the responsibility for the resupply of the Contras?
Well, by the time the February transaction occurred, which did indeed produce revenues, that was very clearly part of the objective.
Now, you testified about what you said to Casey on this, which was that you thought it was a neat idea and that he was enthusiastic. He said it was the ultimate irony, the ultimate covert operation, words to that effect. You recall that testimony? I do. And you said that he recognized the political risks that would accrue if this was exposed.
Well, I'm not sure. When I said that, I don't think I was referring specifically to the linkage between supporting the Nicaraguan freedom fighters and the support that was being derived as a consequence of the sales. I think Director Casey throughout had a recognition of political risk.
But was he
on the things we talked about yesterday on Boland, on dealing straightforward with an Iranian in an effort to get the hostages back, and in an effort to even open up a relationship with the Iranians. I mean, I think he saw political risk in all of these.
Did he discuss with you the political risks of using the surplus or profits from this transaction for covert operations?
Did he discuss with me the political risks of using the surpluses for covert actions?
Yes.
Specifically, I don't believe so until well into the activity, like in October when Furmark showed up.
Did he ever recommend to you that you make sure that you get the approval through channels of the President of the United States?
I recall no such discussion.
Now, you also discussed the use of the residuals or profit for the Contras with Admiral Poindexter, correct?
Correct.
And that was before you put it in any memoranda?
Yeah, and I don't recall specifically on this case, but my normal modus operandi on making a proposal such as that would be to go over and sit down with the Admiral and talk to him. And normally the Admiral would like to think about it.
And
I mean, the Admiral is not a hip shooter, as I am accused of being.
Cautious man?
I think so.
Man who
Prudent.
prudent, man who plays by the book?
My sense is that he is exactly that, and let me just make one personal observation. And maybe I've alluded to this before. You know, there's a long history of rivalry between the services. And he and I are both part of the same naval service. And even though some of my Marine colleagues might not like to hear this, that is an admiral I would follow up any hill, anywhere. And I really mean that, because I think he also saw the necessity of taking risks, and he was willing to do so himself, and he placed himself in jeopardy. And he was the kind of person who recognized the risks, weighed the benefits, and made decisions.
Did he discuss the risks of using the funds for the Contras with you?
Yes.
What did he say?
This had better never come out. And I took steps to ensure that it didn't, and they failed.
And did he discuss that with you when you first raised it? This had better not come out?
I don't recall that specific discussion then. We certainly had it later.
At the time that you first briefed him on it, did you discuss how much money could be generated for the Contras if the 4,000 tows were sold?
Oh, I think I did, and I think I was probably always too enthusiastic in my projections. In the document that we now have shown the world, I anticipated a residual that was in excess of what was realistic.
Did you, do you recall how often, how long after you first told him about this orally, he got back to you?
No, I don't. I guess it was a matter of weeks because, or days or weeks, certainly, because by February we did it.
Now, you testified that in addition to the oral briefing of the Admiral that you just referred to.
Oh, I got myself a little off track. I didn't finish the story. My normal procedure would be to sit down and talk to him. He'd normally say, let me think about it, or prepare a memo on it. I would prepare a memo on it. On numerous occasions, I would run that memo by Director Casey before I sent it to the Admiral. And I'm confident that I did that in this case.
Now,
Director Casey would usually look at it and say, you ought to think about putting this here and that there, or mention such and so, you haven't mentioned it.
well, he was a good writer.
He was remarkable.
Now,
I'm looking forward to his book.
Now, you think he's going to cover this in it?
It'd be interesting to see.
Did he tell you he was before he died?
No, he didn't. Not this particular thing. But I watched him write part of that book, and I'm looking forward to it.
Colonel, when you showed him these memos, which had that, famous line, suggest you brief the president and get the president's approval, did he say, take that out?
No.
Now, you testified, apart from what you've just said about how your practice was of briefing the Admiral orally first.
And I don't want to leave you with the impression I always did it that way, but when there was a difficult issue, we would...
That was your practice?
Yes, sir.
And you testified that, as I said, apart from orally briefing the Admiral, I'll get this question out before the recess, you specifically wanted, and I'm quoting you, before proceeding on a matter of this degree of importance to have the President's approval. Recall that?
I'm sure I said it because I certainly felt that way.
And this was so, even though Director Casey and Admiral Poindexter were in favor of using the profits for the Contras. You still wanted that President's approval. Correct?
Well, yeah, but let's not attach too much significance to my proposing that, because it just seemed to me, as I was working this issue through, that the President ought to have been aware.
Now, you worked under 3 different national security advisors, or 4?
4.
And you had substantial responsibility under how many of them?
Well, I guess 2. I worked very hard when Judge Clark was there.
You have direct contact with Judge Clark, too?
Occasionally.
And
Judge Clark was the one who assigned me to work with the Kissinger Commission.
And you had, based on your experience, formed an opinion as to what issues should be elevated to the President and which ones don't. Is that fair to say?
I would have to be fairly inert not to have figured that out by then. Yes.
And when you wrote memos, you would sometimes have memos that indicated that you wanted just the approval of the National Security Advisor, and in other cases, you would indicate that the National Security Advisor should brief the President and get the President's approval, right?
Yes, and occasionally I was reversed on that, and you certainly have documents of mine in which National Security Advisors crossed out the line that said brief the President, or send the document forward, and he'd write on the bottom, I've taken care of this orally, or things like that.
Is it fair to say, Colonel, that if the National Security Advisor struck out on 1, 2, or 3 memos that related to the diversion, that you should have the president briefed or get his approval, that you wouldn't keep writing memos with that same tagline?
I can assure you, counsel, that if the National Security Advisor had told me not to do anything, I wouldn't have done it.
Now, I would like to direct your attention to the drafts of this memorandum, because actually the memorandum that you were surprised to see that day in the Attorney General's office exists in 4 different copies. And I'd like to go over that with you.
Are you criticizing how well I did my shredding?
Colonel, my eyesight has suffered from reading what you left behind.
I deserved that one. Could you refer me to the exhibit, sir?
Well, 283 is one, and then 283A, are they all marked that way? B and C, and I'm going to put them in an order for you so that we can take a moment. I think it's important. Okay.
Oops. It's hard to see.
Get these people in. Which one is this, Steve? Let me let me show you what I think was the first one. These are all drafts of the same memo. Exhibit 283C is a memorandum which I am advised that your attorney returned to the NSC, Mr. Sullivan returned to the NSC. And that, if you look at the paragraph on the first page, is typed with "on September 14." Do you see the line I'm referring to?
I do.
Then, if you look at 283B, and 283 itself, because 283D, I believe, is just a different copy of it. They have...
Which is a copy of which now?
Look at 283B and 283 next.
Right. Are they not the same?
No, because if you look at 283B, you'll see that the 14 on September 14 is crossed out and 13 is written there, meaning September 13.
Right.
And on 283, the 14 is crossed out and only 3 is put in. So I believe that they are different in that respect. Or if you'll see it clearer if you look at 283D and compare it with 283.
Got it.
Now, so the original draft appeared to have September 14 written on it. Then the 14 was struck out and 13 was written in, and we are told that one of those at least is in the writing of Colonel Earl. And then we have 283A in which the typist made the correction, and that was taken off, and it's typed now September 13, and that was taken off of the disk on Fawn Hall's typewriter by the FBI. So do you follow me?
Okay.
Now first, on the first version of this draft, where did you get the copy that your attorney sent back to the NSC?
Well, let me just make one. You say on the first version. Which first version are we talking about?
That would be 283C,
See.
which is the one that has the September 14 typed without the correction to 13.
Okay. That is one of the documents that I removed from the NSC on the 25th.
And do you know where you found it?
In my files.
Now, do you recall
I want to make something also very clear.
We're going to come into the removal on the 25th, Colonel, so if you want to get into that subject, I think all you'll be doing is repeating
Very well.
that if you go into it now.
Very well.
And I think you want to get this over with. So do we.
The whole thing over with.
This exhibit is very confusing because it does not bear the stamped numbers that we placed on the documents at the time they were returned to the NSC. So we're not sure whether in fact these are the documents.
Well, I don't know what...
I'd like to show you an exhibit that accompanied these documents, so at least the record will be straight regarding the circumstances of their return.
I can tell you that we were told, Mr. Sullivan, that this exhibit came from the documents that you sent back to the NSC. If you have the actual copy of the document you sent, and it is on it, it's just in the typing here, it's number 7.
I'm sorry.
If you look, 139.
Brendan Sullivan, one of his established tactics as a courtroom performer is to have lots of charts, and he has had any number of them, and he's gone to still another one to show the difference between their exhibit and what they have been reading from the committee.
You returned it on December 2.
Could you show us a copy with the number stamp that our law firm placed on the records at the time they were returned?
It's an obscured by the declassification stamp. See, we had to have them declassified.
There is the letter from Brendan Sullivan in poster size. At one point, Arthur Liman said this morning that his eyes had been strained by what Oliver North had left behind. Earlier, before these hearings began, Liman said that he was astounded by the number of documents, something over 100,000 that they were able to go through. Many of them the so-called prof notes being computer notes.
Liman, without the numbers. If I see the numbers clearly, I can tell you whether it's returned, because I believe the only documents in the case that were number stamped by our law firm were the ones that were returned to the NSC, accompanying the cover letter on the poster board dated December 2nd, 1986. We numbered.
The prof notes were the computer messages that were left behind. Oliver North, Poindexter, and others thought that they had erased all of those computer messages, but it turns out that that computer stored the message and it just deleted it from the active computer file.
Okay,
Simply not visible from up here on the dais.
Let me read it to you. It's a letter that Mr. Sullivan wrote on December 2, 1986, in which he said, he addressed it to the NSC, to Commander Thompson. He said, Lieutenant Colonel North is herewith delivering documents to NSC. In order to ensure that the documents are preserved, the pages have been number stamped 1 through, is that 168 inclusive. The document I've just given you has a 139, 140, 141, 42 stamp. You want me to read the rest of it?
Might as well, for sake of a complete
Well,
record.
It's Exhibit 324 in our book, and it says, also delivered are the WHCA Motorola Pageboy, the Motorola handheld portable telephone, and the NSC government transportation request with its number, which I will not read, issued to Lieutenant Colonel North. Would you please arrange for the return of Lieutenant Colonel North's personal property, which is located in his office? He is particularly interested in the prompt return of his Marine Corps uniform items, family photos, and other personal effects. Sincerely yours, Brendan Sullivan, attorney for Lieutenant Colonel Oliver L. North, copy to Brenda Riga. And it's exhibit for members and for others pressed, Exhibit 324. And this bears a stamp number within your group. Now, you got this from your office. Is that established now?
Well, our copies, I can see the number 13.
You can see the...
Written over by the stamp, so I...
And you look at the third page, and you'll see it very clearly, 141.
I see 14. It's been cut off. But I do see...
third page?
I think the Xerox just cut them all off on the right margin.
This may seem like a terribly complicated puzzle to you, but the paper trail in these matters is very, very important.
The documents were returned. If you're trying to associate the numbers with the date particularly, or whether one was prepared before the other, I don't believe that we are able to answer that, of course. Perhaps Colonel North is able to answer from the text, but not from the numbers.
Now, well, Colonel North, do you recall the occasion on which the September 14 was changed to September 13?
No, but I can only guess it's because at some point along the line, I learned that the Israeli government had transferred 508 tows, not on the 14th, but on the 13th, is all I can assume.
And you try to be precise if you learned something was wrong?
To correct it.
And here, you saw the corrections in handwriting, and then the last version, which has it typed, was found on your secretary's typing disk, September 13.
Yes.
And do you know where the actual typed copy of the corrected one is?
I would guess it is in the bag of shredded material.
It's confetti, as we call it.
Confetti.
Right.
I'll call it that too.
Okay.
Good time to call a recess. May I advise members of the Senate that a vote is pending at this time. The committee will stand in recess for 10 minutes.
We have another 10-minute recess this morning, 90 minutes, no fireworks today, but some additional fascinating material and significant to this case as developed by Arthur Liman, Chief Counsel for this Congressional Select Committee investigating the Iran-Contra affair. That's Betsy North, his wife, yesterday in a blue dress, today, as you can see, in a bright red dress. The loyal wife, his best friend, as Oliver North has described her. Today, the nitty-gritty of why he went to Iran, what the motivations were, and what the reservations were within the administration. It's plain that the president was very eager to get the hostages back. However, Oliver North has denied. The president told him that he wanted them back either in time for the elections or for the State of the Union address, which would have been a political bonus to the president, no question about that.